Washington, D.C. Thank you for coming out today, volunteering to do this. Go ahead and tell us your story.
Yeah, so I'm originally from Oklahoma. I was recruited from Oklahoma to join the military in 2003. And in 2003, I was recruited. I served about 4 years. In my fourth year in the military, in the U.S. Army, my lifetime partner was killed in Oklahoma by police. And he was gunned down because he fit a description of a suspect that later was caught, but turned out that it wasn't him. The two officers that shot and killed him never stood trial. They weren't even indicted. So, in an effort to go and see my partner of 7 years, I've been knowing him since I was 14 at that point. We ran our way together. We got our GED together. We dropped out of high school together. We did good things too. He started his first painting business. I started, and I went into the military. And I think in a real effort really to kind of go see him, I told my commanding officer in the military about my sexual orientation, and my commanding officer told me to surrender my weapon and expect a dishonorable discharge by the end of the week. And so I was kicked out of the military after 5 years. With some help of a few friends, I was able to get an honorable discharge. My involvement in this movement, however, really came after I had seen and become and grew more guilty about where I was in my life. After I got out of the military, I went to community college. I transferred from community college to Georgetown, which is in Washington, D.C. And in my final year in Georgetown, after seeing all of the stuff that was going on, I thought, wow, okay, here I am at Georgetown, a relatively privileged institution, and we're learning about peace, and we're learning about how to create movements, and we're learning about how to improve the quality of life for underprivileged folk, but like, what are we actually doing? And I say we, by we I mean me. And so I left, I came to Ferguson and spent some time in Ferguson, and I really think that was the spark for me to channel the energy from what I was learning to actually becoming a practitioner of movement building and capacity. I later understood that so that's kind of like what I did, and that's definitely the way, I guess that's somewhat of my story. I think the ways that police violence has really affected me and my family on many regards. So after I left and I came back to Georgetown, I did what anyone would do. I started a Facebook group. I think it was literally like help me stop police violence or something like that. And I really just saw a lot of people that were posting their stories in the group, and I thought, wow. I started out with just my closest friends, and it was just like 10 people. It's probably close to about 1,400 people in the group now. And I literally was just astonished at the amount of people that had experienced police violence and were clearly articulating the problems existing in the community. And for me, what it was like a wake-up call. It was like, wow, you thought you were one of the only people that experienced police violence. And a lot of times we always think that, this is something that just kind of came about. I think that when I started reading stories in that group, I learned that it isn't something that's new. It's just that at this point we kind of have the technology that allows us to articulate the problems in the community. But beyond that, I think once I had learned that, this is like now my work now. So I hope no one is watching this. My partner's not watching this because he'll probably be mad that I turned down about 5 jobs. And I lived with a really good friend of mine who I also haven't told this, and a mentor to me, but he's here today, so he knows now. And he put me up for about 3 or 4 months, and I lived in his guest room, him and his wife, Mark, Lance, and Amy. And so I launched this company, basically a technology company that's building a mobile application to help record police violence, and then to rate the performance of police officers, and to build the world's first interactive mapping system of police performance in an effort to inform public policy and hold the American justice system accountable. I think, and just to end and wrap that up, something like the way that's affected me, I've learned that the way that this has affected me is actually, my ability to be vulnerable is incredibly difficult at this point. So I spend, once I started investigating my family's history of police violence, it was very different. So I was adopted by my family, and one of the reasons I was adopted by my grandparents is because my mother struggled with substance abuse. It was really interesting how I found out. I was always really upset at her about leaving me and not being there for me. But here, probably about 3 or 4 months ago, what I learned is that one of the reasons my mom got addicted to drugs is because an officer had planted drugs on her. I was born in 85 during the crack epidemic. And back in the crack epidemic, basically in the 1980s, officers would be promoted if they would catch people in the streets and pull them off the streets and brought to the authorities this high level of drugs, right? So they could say, all right, we brought in these people and we brought in this much drugs. Well, sometimes it would bring in a lot of people. They would have a lot of drugs on them, but the cops would keep those drugs. And they would use it to plant on other people that they saw that had only misdemeanors. So they could increase the number of people who would have felonies and increase their possibilities of being promoted. And then everything from there is just showing, hey, we're cleaning up the city, right? And then at that point, my mom was a direct recipient of that policy and that direct action from police forces. She got addicted to crack in prison. She was sent to prison because an officer had planted drugs on her, and subsequently that changed the rest of my life forever. I was only 2 years old, so I got adopted into a different family. I lost track. I didn't even discover a relationship with my mother until I was about 15. And so just recently I was talking to my mom, and she was like, hey, Brandon, it's really interesting because your grandfather, my father, had been organizing around police violence for a little bit, right? Back in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, during the Black Wall Street boom. She was like, yeah, it's very ironic. Your grandfather, I'd never met my grandfather before. But she said, your grandfather organized around police violence as well. This is very interesting. And I said, what do you mean? Yeah, well, back in the 70s, he owned he owned one of the only nightclubs in Oklahoma as a black man. And police would come there and they would harass him often. And I started thinking wow, so here's a man that I've never met ever in my life. And he he's still here we are, years later, dealing with the exact same problem. And it's just fascinating, I think, the way the problem has remained the same. In another instance, so one of the reasons that I ran away from home, that really bad part of my story I told you about, I was 14, I ran away from home because I had some problems with my grandparents. One of the reasons I had problems with my grandparents is because I took a BB gun to school. And I was about 14. And granted, this was about 15 years ago, right? I brought a BB gun to school and I got expelled. I don't know, I'm sure you all are familiar with Tamir Rice, who was 12 years old and had a BB gun, and he was shot and killed by an officer. So it's kind of like the progression as we move closer and as we move, as time progresses, the problem doesn't seem to be getting better. In all accounts for me, as I understand it, the problem seems to be getting worse. So I bring a BB gun to school, I get suspended. Somebody else brings a BB gun to school 15 years later, they're shot and killed, right? And then the problem, in the same instance, talking about my grandfather organized around police violence in the 1970s. Here I am years later, never met my grandfather, and we have to organize around some of the same problems. To wrap that up, like what that's done to me psychologically, because I'm still here, right? I'm still alive. I haven't lost a limb, right? So like that's powerful in itself. But I think really the way that this has affected me and my life is my ability to be vulnerable with people, because like I've been to those places where I am vulnerable, right? I've been out in the middle of a desert with me and another person with just an M16 and expecting to fight off 300 soldiers. Like your level of vulnerability that you've given to the U.S. military, and then after 5 years later, because of your sexual orientation, you're saying that you're not enough to be doing that. Like that's an intense level of vulnerability, wouldn't you say? And so with that sense, like it's difficult for me to be vulnerable, right? And this is the same thing when I go. So even when you're in the streets, like, Brother Mel talked about it when he was up here, the level of vulnerability is just, like, don't expect us to be vulnerable, right? Don't expect us to live our lives. We're always on alert now. Like, I live my life on alert. I got to make sure my door is locked. I got to make sure if there's a cop behind me. Yeah, shit is intense now. And I think for me, what's been difficult is building, vulnerability for me is though important, however, right? It's the birthplace of creativity. It's the birthplace of joy, of love. Like in order for me to allow other people into my life, it's important that they see me as I am in my vulnerable state. And if I can't do that, it's the difference between creating intimate and meaningful relationships with the people that mean something to me. Because I'm not able to be vulnerable in those places any longer, it's difficult for me to build capacity. It's difficult for me to find love. It's difficult for me to see value in being vulnerable. So to end, I guess, if vulnerability for so much of America is an asset in building meaningful and intimate relationships, for me, and I think for a great number of black people, it's a liability because it keeps us at bay, it keeps us harmed. So while some parts of the country build intimate and meaningful relationships with their use of vulnerability, black and brown people don't have the ability because we lack the level of vulnerability. And that psychologically has been the most damaging, I think, to me. To close out on a more positive note, like this is my opportunity to be vulnerable, right? Right now, I'm being vulnerable. And I just like to say, like this opportunity to be this, it's probably one of the most. The Black Panthers always had in their 10 statements, one of the things they had was like, get liberated. Like, how would you ever be able to get liberated? Okay, how do you start that? But like, real talk, I think like this is what liberation looks like. Being able to be vulnerable in a space with people that affirm your identity and that recognize you as being valuable. That for me is my liberation. So in my 10 commandments in terms of the Black Panthers get liberation, like this 5 minutes has been doing that. Appreciate it.
So you did that so well. You took every question from me. There's no question left on my script. Everything is done. So we just want to thank you for coming all the way from DC to share with us. You shared this with the world now. We appreciate you. And your fight, whether it's at Georgetown or wherever you're taking it to, we stand with you. Ferguson is with you. You know, you're fam now. So God bless you. We just want to say we love you and keep on.
Thank you. Appreciate it.